I felt the earth disappear beneath my feet before I could even scream. One moment, I was standing on solid ground, breathing in the crisp mountain air with my husband Henry beside me. The next, my son Damien's hands were on my back and I was falling. The world turned into a blur of sky and stone, spinning wildly as gravity pulled me down that 90-foot cliff face. My body slammed against rocks, each impact sending fire through my bones. I heard Henry's grunt somewhere beside me, the sickening sound of flesh meeting stone. And then, finally, we hit the bottom. The pain was everywhere. My ribs screamed with each shallow breath. My leg twisted beneath me at an angle that couldn't be natural. Blood filled my mouth, warm and metallic, and I could feel it pooling beneath my head. Through blurred vision, I could see the cliff face towering above us, impossibly high, impossibly cruel. And at the top, two shadows stood looking down. One of them was my son. Mom? Dad? Damien's voice drifted down, tentative, almost convincing in its concern. Almost. I tried to move, tried to call out, but Henry's hand found mine in the dirt and leaves. His grip was weak, trembling, but his whisper was sharp and clear. Don't move. Pretend we're dead. His words cut through my shock like ice water. Pretend we're dead. My own son had just pushed us off a cliff, and my husband was telling me to play dead. The horror of it paralyzed me more effectively than my broken bones ever could. I let my body go limp, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to move, to cry out, to demand answers. Through barely open eyes, I watched the shadows at the cliff's edge. I could hear Melissa's voice now, too, my daughter-in-law, sharp and impatient. Are they moving? I don't think so, Damien replied. There was something in his tone, something cold and calculated that I'd never heard before. Or maybe I had, and I'd just never wanted to believe it. We should go. Someone might come. Their footsteps crunched away through the forest undergrowth, growing fainter with each passing second. And there we lay, Henry and I, broken and bleeding at the bottom of a cliff, listening to our son walk away from what he thought were our corpses. The man I had carried for 9 months, nursed through fevers, taught to ride a bike, sent off to college with tears in my eyes. That man had just tried to murder us. But even as the pain threatened to drag me into unconsciousness, even as I tasted my own blood and felt the warm wetness spreading beneath my skull, one thought kept circling through my mind. Henry had said, pretend, not play, as if he'd been expecting this, as if he'd known this was coming. And suddenly, lying there in the dirt and fallen leaves, I realized that this moment had been 25 years in the making. The real horror wasn't the fall. It was the secret Henry had kept for all those years, the truth that had finally caught up with us on this remote mountain trail. The truth about what Damien was capable of. The truth about what he'd already done once before. The truth about how our other son really died. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we ended up at the bottom of that cliff, you need to understand what our life was before. You need to know about the family we used to be. Back when I still believed in the goodness of both my sons. Back when our little house was filled with laughter instead of lies. My name is Hilda, and for 37 years I taught 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. I loved my job, loved the wonder in children's eyes when they finally understood a difficult concept, loved the messy artwork they'd present to me with gap-toothed smiles. Henry was a carpenter and a brilliant one. His hands could coax beauty from raw wood, could transform simple planks into furniture that people cherished for generations. We weren't wealthy, not by any stretch, but we had enough. We had each other. We had our little house with the blue shutters that Henry painted every spring. And we had our 2 sons. Richard was our firstborn. And from the moment he came into the world, he was sunshine personified. Warm, protective, always quick with a joke or a hug. He had Henry's steady hands and my love of reading. Even as a child, he'd defend smaller kids from bullies, bring home stray animals, share his lunch with classmates who'd forgotten theirs. Richard made the world feel safer just by existing in it. Damien came 3 years later, and he was different. Quieter, more serious, always watching with those dark eyes that seemed older than his years. Where Richard was open and expressive, Damien kept his thoughts close, his feelings hidden. But I loved him just as fiercely. He was my baby, my sensitive boy who needed extra patience, extra understanding. When Richard would bound through the door shouting about his day, Damien would slip in quietly, offering me a small smile that felt like a secret just between us. They were so different, my boys, but they loved each other. Or at least, I thought they did. I have so many memories of them together. Richard teaching Damien to throw a baseball in the backyard, patient and encouraging even when Damien's throws went wild. Damien sitting quietly beside Richard's bed when Richard had the flu, reading comic books aloud in his soft voice. The two of them building a treehouse in the old oak, arguing over design, but always reaching a compromise. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house. Henry would roast a chicken, and I'd make my grandmother's apple pie. We'd sit around our small dining table, the four of us, and talk about everything and nothing. Richard would tell elaborate stories about his week, making us laugh until our sides hurt. Damien would listen, occasionally adding a dry comment that was funnier for its unexpected timing. Henry would reach over and squeeze my hand, and I'd look around at my family and think, this is it. This is everything. I remember Richard's high school graduation, how proud we were as he walked across that stage. He'd earned a scholarship to the state university, planned to study engineering. Damien was 14 then, sitting between Henry and me in the auditorium, and when Richard's name was called, I could have sworn I saw pride in Damien's eyes too. That night, we celebrated at Richard's favorite restaurant, and he raised his glass of soda and toasted, "To family." The only thing that really matters. Damien raised his glass too. I remember that distinctly. The clink of glass against glass, the small smile on his face. Had I imagined the coldness in his eyes? Had it always been there, lurking beneath the surface, and I'd simply refused to see it? The summer Richard turned 21 was perfect. He'd come home for break, still enthusiastic about his classes, full of plans for the future. He wanted to design bridges, he told us over dinner one night. Think about it, Dad. You build furniture that lasts a lifetime. I want to build structures that last for generations. We're not so different, you and me. Henry's eyes had shone with unshed tears of pride. And Damien, 18 now and working at the hardware store in town, had smiled and said, "Sounds like you've got it all figured out. Big brother." There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite place, something that made me glance at him more closely. But Richard just laughed and ruffled Damien's hair affectionately, and the moment passed. Another red flag I missed, another warning I didn't heed. Our last family photo was taken that August. The four of us standing in front of the house, Henry's arm around my shoulders, Richard and Damien flanking us on either side. I have that photo on my bedside table even now, though it hurts to look at it. We're all smiling. We look like the perfect family. We look like people who trust each other completely. 6 weeks later, Richard was dead. I didn't know it then, but our perfect family had already begun to rot from the inside. The decay had started long before that August photograph, probably long before I'd ever noticed. Maybe it had been there from the beginning, written into Damien's DNA, a darkness that no amount of love or attention could ever illuminate. Or maybe something had happened to twist him, to hollow out whatever capacity for goodness he'd been born with. I'll never really know. What I do know is that the family in that photograph was already living on borrowed time. The people we appeared to be were already dissolving, being replaced by something uglier, something dangerous. And I, believing so completely in the sanctity of family, in the unbreakable bonds of blood, was blind to it all. The night Richard died, the phone rang at 2 a.m. No one ever calls with good news at 2 a.m. I remember Henry stumbling out of bed, his voice rough with sleep as he answered. I remember sitting up, my heart already racing, some primal part of me understanding that our lives were about to shatter before my conscious mind could even process the words. I remember Henry's face going white in the glow of the bedside lamp, his knuckles white where he gripped the phone. "What do you mean, found him?" "Found him where?" The police told us Richard had been hiking alone near Devil's Gorge, about 20 miles outside town. A place he'd been dozens of times, a trail he knew like the back of his hand. Somehow, they said, he'd fallen. The drop was 60 feet onto rocks and shallow water. He died instantly. An accident, they said. A tragic, terrible accident. We drove to the hospital in silence, Henry's hands shaking on the steering wheel, my body numb and disconnected like I was watching someone else's life unfold. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Just yesterday, Richard had called to tell me about a girl he'd met in his civil engineering class, his voice bright with possibility. Just yesterday, he'd been alive, full of future, full of dreams about bridges and buildings and the life he was going to build. They let us see him, though I wish now they hadn't. That wasn't Richard lying on that cold metal table. Richard was warmth and laughter and bear hugs that lifted me off my feet. That broken thing covered by a white sheet was just a shell, an empty vessel that my son had left behind. I collapsed, and Henry caught me, and we clung to each other in that sterile room while our world ended. Damien met us at the hospital. I don't even remember who called him, whether it was us or the police or someone else. My memories of that night are fragmented, pieces of a nightmare that don't quite connect properly. But I remember seeing him in the waiting room when we emerged, remember how pale he was, how still. He stood when he saw us, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Is it true? His voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't speak, couldn't form words. Henry nodded, and Damien's face crumpled. He sank back into the plastic chair, his hands covering his face. I should have gone to him, should have gathered my surviving son into my arms and mourned with him. But I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything but stand there and feel the emptiness spreading through my chest where my heart used to be. The funeral was 3 days later. Half the town came. Richard had been loved, truly loved, by so many people. His engineering professors spoke about his brilliant mind and kind heart. His friends told stories that made the congregation laugh through their tears. Henry and I sat in the front pew, holding hands so tightly I thought our bones might fuse together. Damien sat beside us, dry-eyed and silent. That's what I remember most clearly from that day. How Damien didn't cry, not during the service, not at the graveside, not at the reception afterward at our house when people told him how sorry they were for his loss. He accepted their condolences with a small nod, his face expressionless, his eyes distant. People probably thought he was in shock, that grief had frozen him, but I was his mother. I knew every expression, every mood, and what I saw in his face that day wasn't grief. It was nothing. Absolutely nothing, like he was watching a play about someone else's tragedy, mildly interested, but ultimately unmoved. He's just processing differently, Henry said that night, after everyone had left and we were alone in our too-quiet house. Everyone grieves in their own way. I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him, but something about Damien's blank stare at the funeral had planted a seed of unease deep in my gut. I pushed it away, buried it under layers of my own grief and exhaustion. I had just lost one son. I couldn't bear to question the one I had left. The police investigation concluded quickly. Richard's death was ruled an accidental fall. He'd been hiking alone, they said, probably got too close to the edge in the dark. The trail near Devil's Gorge was treacherous, especially at night. It was a tragedy, but these things happened. Case closed, but Henry changed after that. Not immediately, not obviously, but gradually, like a photograph slowly fading in sunlight. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. He'd spend hours in his workshop, and I'd hear the sounds of his tools, but never see any finished projects emerge. He'd wake up from nightmares, gasping, and when I'd ask what he'd dreamed, he'd just shake his head and hold me tighter. I miss him, he'd say. God, Hilda, I miss our boy. I know, I'd whisper back. I know, but I didn't know, not really. I didn't know that Henry's grief was poisoned with guilt. I didn't know that he was carrying a secret that was slowly destroying him from the inside out. I didn't know that Richard's death wasn't an accident at all, that there had been 2 people on that trail that night, not one. If only I had asked more questions. If only I had pushed harder, demanded answers instead of accepting the neat narrative the police had constructed. If only I had trusted that seed of unease instead of burying it under my own desperate need to believe that our family, our remaining family, was still intact and safe and good. If only I had known then what Damien was capable of. Maybe I could have protected us. Maybe I could have stopped what was coming. Maybe we never would have ended up on that cliff. The years after Richard's death were gray. That's the only way I can describe them. Like someone had drained all the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of grief and shadow. I kept teaching, kept going through the motions of my life, but the joy had leaked out of everything. Henry kept working, kept building furniture, but the light had gone out of his eyes. And Damien, our surviving son, drifted further and further away from us. He moved out when he turned 21, got an apartment across town. We saw him less and less, maybe once a month for a brief dinner that was more obligation than comfort. He worked various jobs, never seeming to settle on anything, never seeming to build toward any particular future. He'd show up occasionally asking for money, always with reasonable explanations. Car repairs, unexpected bills, a security deposit for a better apartment. Henry would write the checks without question, and I'd watch Damien pocket them with that same blank expression he'd worn at Richard's funeral. When Damien turned 30, he brought a woman to Sunday dinner. Melissa was her name, and she was stunning in a sharp, calculated way. Perfect makeup, designer clothes, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked in real estate, she told us, and was very successful. She touched Damien's arm possessively throughout the meal, and when she looked at him, I saw something in her expression that made my skin prickle. Not love, assessment. Like he was an investment she was evaluating. They married 4 months later in a courthouse ceremony. We weren't invited. We found out after the fact when Damien called to tell us, his tone casual, almost indifferent. I cried that night, though I couldn't entirely explain why. I should have been happy that my son had found someone, that he wasn't alone. But something about Melissa set my teeth on edge, activated that same instinct that had troubled me at Richard's funeral. Give her a chance, Henry said, though his own voice lacked conviction. Maybe she'll be good for him. She wasn't. Over the next few years, Damien and Melissa became more present in our lives, but not in any way that brought comfort. They'd drop by unexpectedly, always seeming to time their visits for when Henry had just sold a major piece of furniture or when I'd mentioned receiving my annual raise. The conversations would inevitably drift to money, to how hard things were, how expensive everything had become. They never asked directly, not at first, but the implications hung in the air like smoke. Henry kept writing checks. I kept my concerns to myself, buried under the complicated weight of maternal guilt and grief. Damien was all we had left. How could I question him? How could I suggest that my own son, the child I'd carried and raised and loved, might be using us? By the time we reached our 60s, Henry and I had built a comfortable life for ourselves. Henry's furniture had gained a reputation, and wealthy clients commissioned pieces for significant sums. I'd taught for 40 years and had a pension. We'd paid off the house decades ago. We weren't rich, but we were secure, comfortable. We'd started talking about our will, about how to ensure everything was handled properly when we were gone. That's when Damien and Melissa's visits became more frequent. More focused, it started subtly, as these things often do. Melissa would compliment the house, mention how valuable the property must be. Damien would casually ask about our retirement accounts, our investments. They'd share stories about friends whose parents had failed to plan properly, leaving their children to navigate complicated legal battles. They were so concerned about us, they said, so worried that we might not have everything in order. You should really talk to our lawyer, Melissa suggested one Sunday. Estate planning is so complex. You want to make sure everything goes smoothly for Damien when the time comes. When the time comes. The phrase sent ice down my spine, but I smiled and nodded and told her we'd think about it. Beside me, Henry's hand found mine under the table, squeezed once, a silent message I couldn't quite interpret. The pressure increased like a slowly tightening vice. Every visit, every phone call, the conversation would somehow circle back to our will, our assets, the importance of proper planning. Melissa sent us names of lawyers, financial advisors, estate planners. Damien would call to check if we'd made any decisions yet, his voice carrying an edge of impatience that made my stomach clench. We're not getting any younger, I told Henry one night. Maybe we should get everything in order, make it easier for Damien. Henry was quiet for a long moment, staring at the wall like he could see through it into some distant past. Do you trust him? The question shocked me. Henry, he's our son. That's not what I asked. I opened my mouth to protest, to defend Damien automatically the way mothers do. But the words died in my throat. Did I trust him? Did I trust the blank-faced man at his brother's funeral? Did I trust the son who only called when he needed money? Did I trust Damien, who looked at me sometimes with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, nothing but cold calculation? I don't know, I whispered finally. The admission felt like betrayal, but also like relief. I want to, but I don't know. Henry pulled me close, and we sat in silence for a while. Finally, he said, "We'll update the will, but we'll do it our way, with our own lawyer, and we'll make sure there are protections built in." We met with Martha Chen, an attorney I'd known for years through the school district. She was sharp, thorough, and most importantly, she had no connection to Damien or Melissa. We explained our situation carefully. We had one living son, but we wanted safeguards. We wanted provisions that couldn't be easily manipulated. Martha listened and made notes, her expression professional but sympathetic. "I understand. You want to provide for your son, but you also want to protect yourselves. That's not unusual, especially with complicated family dynamics." She drafted a will that left everything to Damien, but with conditions. The house couldn't be sold immediately. The investments would be released gradually. There was a provision for Henry and me to maintain control of our assets during our lifetime, with Damien only inheriting after both of us had passed. It felt like a compromise between parental love and practical caution. We didn't tell Damien or Melissa about the details. We just mentioned that we'd finally gotten our affairs in order, that everything was handled. I thought they'd be relieved, satisfied that their concerns had been addressed. Instead, Melissa's eyes narrowed, and Damien's questions became sharper. "Did you use the lawyer we recommended? What exactly does the will say? Are there any complications? Any delays in the inheritance?" Their interest was too intense, too focused. It stopped being about concern for our well-being and became obviously about the money, about when and how they'd get access to it. The mask had slipped, and I could see the calculation beneath. They weren't worried about us. They were worried about their return on investment. "They're angry," I told Henry after one particularly tense visit. "Did you see Melissa's face when you said there were protections built into the will? She looked like she wanted to scream. I saw." Henry's voice was heavy with something I couldn't name. "Regret? Fear? Hilda, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 25 years ago." My heart started pounding before he even continued. Some deep part of me knew, had always known, that there was more to Richard's death than we'd been told, that the truth was darker and more terrible than I'd let myself believe. "It wasn't an accident," Henry said, and his voice cracked on the words. Richard didn't fall. He was pushed, the room tilted. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to anchor myself as the world I thought I knew dissolved around me. "What are you talking about?" Henry's face was gray, aged decades in seconds. His hands shook as he covered his face. "I was there that night. I saw it. God help me, Hilda. I saw everything." The story came pouring out of him like poison from a wound. How Damien had called Richard that night, asked him to meet at Devil's Gorge to talk about something important. How Henry, worried about the tension he'd sensed between his sons, had followed, staying back on the trail but close enough to watch. How he'd seen them talking on the cliff's edge, seen the conversation grow heated. "Richard found out Damien had been stealing from us," Henry said, his voice hollow. "Do you remember when you thought you'd lost that envelope with the cash for the car payment? And when my tool order went missing? Richard figured out it was Damien. He confronted him that night, told him he had to come clean, had to make it right." I remembered. Small things had gone missing over the years. Nothing major, and we'd always assumed we'd misplaced items or miscalculated. The idea that our own son had been stealing from us had never even occurred to me. What happened? I could barely force the words out, they argued. Richard said he was going to tell us that Damien needed help, and Damien just looked at him, cold, empty. He said, "No, you won't." And then he pushed him. Henry's whole body shook with sobs. I saw my son murder my other son. I watched Richard fall, watched him hit the rocks, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything. By the time I could function again, Damien was gone. I climbed down to Richard, but he was already dead. Already gone. Why didn't you tell anyone? My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and cold. Why didn't you tell me? Because he's our son. Henry's anguish was raw and terrible. Because I couldn't destroy our family even more than it was already destroyed. Because I thought maybe it was an accident. Maybe Damien panicked. Maybe he didn't mean it. Because I was a coward, Hilda. Because I chose the son who was alive over justice for the son who was dead. and I've had to live with that choice every single day since. I stood up, my legs somehow supporting me, even though I felt like I was falling. Falling like Richard must have fallen. You knew. All these years you knew what he was and you said nothing. I'm sorry. Henry reached for me, but I stepped back. God, Hilda, I'm so sorry. I walked away from him, locked myself in the bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left. When I finally emerged, hours later, Henry was sitting exactly where I'd left him, tears streaming down his face. We didn't speak. What was there to say? He'd kept a terrible secret, and in doing so, he'd let a murderer remain free. Our son was a murderer, and we'd invited him into our home, written him into our will, tried to maintain a relationship with him even as every instinct screamed that something was wrong. The next few days passed in a haze of horror and disbelief. I kept looking at Henry and seeing a stranger, kept thinking about Richard and wanting to scream. But slowly, painfully, I began to understand. Henry had made an impossible choice in an impossible moment, and he'd spent 25 years drowning in guilt and fear. He'd been terrified that if Damien knew he'd been seen, he'd act again. He'd been protecting us in the only way he knew how, by keeping the monster at a distance, by never fully trusting him even if he couldn't bring himself to expose him. What do we do now? I asked finally. Henry looked at me with hollow eyes. We wait and we watch, and we pray we're wrong about what he's planning. But we weren't wrong. The phone calls from Damien and Melissa became more frequent, more insistent. They wanted to meet, needed to discuss some important family matters. They suggested a family outing, a way to reconnect, to rebuild the relationship that had grown distant over the years. How about a hike? Melissa suggested, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. Somewhere beautiful. Just the four of us. Quality time before you get too old to enjoy these things. Henry and I looked at each other across the room. In his eyes, I saw the same terrible understanding that I felt in my bones. When Damien called to invite us to the mountains, we knew. We knew this was how our son would finish what he started 25 years ago. This was how he planned to get his inheritance without waiting for nature to take its course. That night, Henry whispered, "Pretend we're dead." And I understood that he'd been preparing for this moment for 25 years. The day of the hike dawned clear and beautiful, the kind of perfect autumn morning that belonged in paintings, not in nightmares. Damien picked us up at 8, Melissa in the passenger seat, both of them wearing expensive hiking gear and bright smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "You're going to love this trail," Melissa said as we climbed into the back seat. "It's absolutely stunning. The views from the top are breathtaking, breathtaking." The word felt like prophecy. Henry had his phone in his jacket pocket, the voice recording app already running. He'd started recording the moment Damien's car pulled into our driveway. We didn't know if it would matter, if anyone would ever hear it. But it was the only weapon we had. Evidence, truth. The things that had been buried for 25 years. The drive took 90 minutes, winding deeper into the mountains, further from civilization. Damien and Melissa kept up a steady stream of cheerful chatter, talking about their plans for the future, the house they wanted to buy, the life they were going to build. Everything they said was laced with expense, with need, with the unspoken expectation of money they didn't have yet, but believed was coming soon. "You two should really think about moving into a retirement community," Melissa said, glancing back at us. "These big houses are so much work at your age. You could sell, downsize, enjoy your golden years without all the stress of maintenance." Translation: give us access to the house equity now instead of making us wait. "We like our house," I said quietly. "We're not ready to leave it yet." Melissa's smile tightened. "Of course. Just something to consider. Eventually, when we were dead and no longer had a say in the matter." The trailhead parking lot was empty when we arrived. Remote location, weekday morning, late season. Damien had chosen well. No witnesses. No one to see 4 people hike into the woods and only 2 emerge. My hands shook as I stepped out of the car, but I forced them steady. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. The hike started easily enough. The trail wound through dense forest, dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, the air cool and crisp. Damien led the way, Melissa behind him, then me, then Henry bringing up the rear. It felt symbolic somehow. Our son leading us to our deaths, our marriage bringing up the rear, the last defense between the past and the future. They made small talk as we walked. Melissa pointed out birds, Damien mentioned landmarks. It was all so normal, so pleasant, that I might have doubted our suspicions if not for the cold certainty in my gut. This was a performance, a script they'd rehearsed. The loving son and daughter-in-law taking the elderly parents on one last beautiful hike before their tragic accident. After about 40 minutes, the trail began to climb more steeply. The trees thinned, replaced by rock and scrub brush. We were getting close to the cliff face now. I could feel it in the changing terrain, in the way the wind picked up, carrying the scent of altitude and stone. My heart pounded so hard I thought they'd surely hear it, thought the sound would echo off the rocks and give away our knowledge of what was coming. "Just a little further," Damien called back. "The view is amazing from up here." We rounded a bend, and suddenly the forest opened up. Before us stretched a panoramic vista of mountains and valleys, breathtaking in its scope and beauty. And at our feet, a cliff face dropped 90 feet to rocks and scattered trees below. My vision swam. It wasn't Devil's Gorge, but it might as well have been. This was Richard's death recreated, history repeating itself with different victims, but the same murderer. "Wow," Melissa breathed. "Isn't it incredible?" She moved to stand near the edge, and I saw her glance at Damien. A communication passed between them, silent and swift. This was the place. This was the moment they'd been planning. "Come stand over here," Damien said, gesturing to us. "I want to get a picture of all of us with the view. A picture. Evidence that we'd been here, smiling and happy, right before our terrible accident." My feet felt rooted to the ground, but Henry touched my elbow gently, and we moved forward together. We stood where Damien indicated, our backs to the cliff, the abyss yawning behind us. Damien pulled out his phone, held it up like he was framing a shot. Melissa moved to stand beside us, positioning herself on my other side. We were bracketed now, Damien in front, Melissa beside us, the cliff at our backs. "Trapped. Smile," Damien said. But he wasn't looking at the phone screen. He was looking at us, and in his eyes I saw nothing. No love, no regret, no humanity. Just cold calculation and the certainty that he was about to get everything he'd been waiting for. This was the same look he'd worn at Richard's funeral, the same emptiness he'd carried all his life, the void where empathy should have lived. "I know what you did," Henry said suddenly. His voice was steady, clear, carrying across the mountaintop like a bell. "I know you killed Richard." Damien's expression didn't change, but Melissa's head whipped toward him, shock and confusion flashing across her face. "What is he talking about?" "I was there that night," Henry continued. "I saw you push your brother off the cliff. I saw you murder him." For a long moment nobody moved. The wind whistled around us, cold and sharp. Then Damien smiled. "It was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen." "You saw?" His voice was almost amused. "And yet you never said anything. Never told anyone. Why do you think that is, Dad?" "Because I was a fool. Because I thought you were my son. And some part of me wanted to believe it was an accident, that you weren't a monster." "But I am," Damien said simply. "And you've known it for 25 years. Which makes you complicit. Which makes you guilty too." Melissa was backing away now, her face pale, realizing she'd married someone far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. But Damien ignored her. His focus was entirely on us. "You should have kept your mouth shut," he said. "Should have just fallen like good little victims and made this easy." "Why?" The question tore out of me. "Why would you do this? We're your parents. We loved you." "Love." He said the word like it tasted bad. What did love ever get Richard? What did it get you? "You're old, you're in the way, and I'm tired of waiting for my inheritance." He stepped closer. "Accidents happen. Especially to elderly people who shouldn't be hiking at their age. It happens so fast." Damien's hands came up, and Melissa, whether from panic or practiced planning, moved at the same moment. They shoved us hard, coordinated and simultaneous. The edge of the cliff disappeared beneath my feet, and then I was falling, tumbling through air with Henry beside me. The impacts came in rapid succession. Shoulder against rock, hip, ribs, head. Each collision brought fresh agony, fresh clarity. This was how Richard died. This was what he felt in his last moments. Terror and pain and the betrayal of family. The ground rushed up to meet us, and then everything went dark. Pain pulled me back to consciousness. Everywhere, all at once, a symphony of agony that made me want to sink back into the darkness. But Henry's hand was gripping mine, and his voice was in my ear, urgent and low. "Don't move. Pretend we're dead." I forced my body to stay limp, even though every instinct screamed to curl around my injuries, to cry out, to seek help. Through barely opened eyes, I could see the cliff face towering above us. And at the top, 2 figures looking down. "Mom? Dad?" Damien's voice drifted down, and if I hadn't known better, I might have believed the concern in it. But I did know better now. I knew exactly what he was. Blood pooled beneath my head, warm and wet. My leg was bent wrong, my ribs grinding against each other with every shallow breath. But I stayed still. Played the part Henry had directed. Pretended to be another victim of my son's ambition. "Are they moving?" Melissa's voice was higher, more panicked. "I don't think so." A pause. "We should go. Someone might come." Their footsteps faded, crunching through leaves and undergrowth. The sound of them leaving us for dead was almost worse than the fall itself. We lay there in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Henry squeezed my hand. "They're gone," he whispered. "Oh God, Hilda, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I brought you into this." "You didn't," I managed through lips that tasted of blood. "He did. Our son did this. I must have drifted in and out of consciousness after that." I remember Henry talking to me, his voice rough and strained but determined, telling me to stay awake, stay with him. Help was coming. I remember him somehow dragging himself to his phone, his own injuries making every movement agony, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. I remember his voice giving our location, saying the words, "pushed off a cliff by our son," in a tone of utter devastation. And I remember him making one more call. To our lawyer, Martha Chen. Telling her everything, the recording still running on his phone, making sure that even if we didn't survive, the truth would. The sound of helicopter blades woke me fully. Rescue paramedics rappelled down the cliff face, their faces shocked at finding us alive. They moved efficiently, checking vitals, stabilizing our injuries, preparing us for evacuation. "Can you tell me what happened?" one of them asked gently as he worked on my leg. Henry and I exchanged a glance. "We fell," Henry said simply. The paramedic frowned, clearly suspicious, but he didn't push. They loaded us onto stretchers, lifted us one at a time up to the waiting helicopter. The flight to the hospital was a blur of pain and noise, and the surreal understanding that we'd survived. Against all odds, despite our son's best efforts, we were alive. At the hospital, they rushed us into surgery. I had a fractured skull, broken ribs, a shattered femur, internal bleeding. Henry had a collapsed lung, spinal fractures, a broken arm. The doctors told us later that we were lucky. That falling 90 feet should have killed us. That the angle of the slope and the vegetation had slowed our fall, just enough to make the difference between life and death. Lucky. That wasn't the word I would have used. When I woke from surgery, there was a police officer sitting beside my bed. She introduced herself as Detective Sarah Morrison and explained that any fall from such a height warranted investigation. She asked me to walk her through the events of the day, her voice gentle but her eyes sharp. I told her the truth. About Damien and Melissa pushing us. About Richard's murder 25 years ago. About Henry's recording that should have captured everything. She listened without interrupting, taking notes, her expression growing grimmer with every word. "Your son and daughter-in-law are claiming you fell while taking a photo," she said finally. "They called 911 themselves, very upset, reported it as an accident. They're at the hospital now, in the waiting room, telling anyone who'll listen how devastated they are." "They pushed us," I said again. My voice was stronger now, fueled by anger that was finally breaking through the shock. "They murdered Richard and they tried to murder us. And they need to pay for it." Detective Morrison nodded. "We'll need to examine your husband's phone. And we'll need formal statements from both of you." She left, and I lay in my hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, letting tears finally fall. Richard's face swam in my memory, bright and laughing and so full of life. He'd been gone for 25 years, buried and mourned and supposedly avenged by time and acceptance. But he'd never had justice. He'd never had truth, now he would. The next days unfolded like a strange dream. Henry and I were in adjacent rooms, our injuries too severe to allow us to be together. But the nurses kept the connecting door open so we could at least see each other. We couldn't speak much, both too medicated and exhausted, but just knowing he was there was comfort. Detective Morrison visited daily. Henry's recording, it turned out, had captured everything. Every word Damien had said on that mountaintop, every moment of the confrontation, even the sounds of them pushing us and our bodies hitting the rocks. It was damning evidence, irrefutable proof of attempted murder, but there was more. A nurse named Rebecca had been near the waiting room when Damien and Melissa arrived at the hospital. She'd overheard them talking, thinking they were alone, and what she heard made her blood run cold. "Do you think they're dead?" Melissa had asked. "They better be," Damien had replied. "If they survive, we're screwed. We need to get to their lawyer, change that will before anyone thinks to lock it down." Rebecca had immediately reported the conversation to hospital security, who'd contacted the police. Between Henry's recording, Rebecca's testimony, and the forensic evidence at the scene, the case against Damien and Melissa was overwhelming. They were arrested 3 days after our fall, taken into custody as they tried to visit us in the hospital. I heard later that Damien had maintained his innocence right up until they played him the recording. Then he'd gone silent, that same blank expression settling over his face that I'd seen so many times before. Empty, hollow. A man without remorse or conscience or soul. The case made headlines. Son pushes elderly parents off cliff for inheritance. The story had everything the media loved: family drama, attempted murder, a dramatic rescue. Reporters camped outside the hospital, trying to get interviews, photos, any scrap of our tragedy they could sell to an eager public. But Detective Morrison and the hospital staff protected us. They gave no details, allowed no access, let us heal in private while the investigation proceeded. And as I lay in that hospital bed, slowly recovering from injuries that should have killed me, I thought about Richard. I thought about the 25 years he'd been denied, the bridges he never built, the life he never lived, the family he never had. I thought about how Damien had stolen all of that with one push, one moment of calculated violence. And I thought about how Henry and I had nearly joined Richard in the grave. 2 more victims of a monster we'd raised without ever seeing the truth. The trial took months to prepare, but when it finally happened, it was swift. The evidence was too clear, too overwhelming for any defense. Henry's recording played in court, and I watched the jury's faces pale as they heard our son confess to murder, as they heard him condemn us to death with such casual indifference. Melissa testified against Damien, trying to save herself, claiming she'd been manipulated, that she hadn't known about Richard. The jury didn't believe her. They found Damien guilty of first-degree murder in Richard's death and attempted murder in our case. Melissa was convicted as an accomplice. The judge, an elderly woman with steel in her eyes, looked at Damien and said, "You are everything that is wrong with humanity. You killed for greed, you betrayed family for money, and you did it all without a shred of remorse. May you spend the rest of your life contemplating the emptiness where your soul should be." Damien's sentence: life without parole. Melissa's: 25 years, I should have felt satisfaction. I should have felt relief, or vindication, or justice finally served. Instead, I just felt tired. Tired and sad and impossibly old. Because what had we won, really? Richard was still dead. 25 years of his life had been stolen, and no courtroom verdict could give them back. Damien was our son, and some broken part of me still mourned what he could have been, even as I hated what he was. But there was one small light in all the darkness. Damien and Melissa had 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, 7 years old. In the aftermath of their parents' arrests, with no other family willing or able to take them, they needed a home. Henry and I talked about it from our hospital beds, holding hands across the gap between our rooms. We were in our 60s, recovering from massive trauma, nowhere near ideal guardians for young children. But they were family. They were innocents caught in a tragedy not of their making. And maybe, just maybe, we could break the cycle. We could raise these children with truth and love and honesty, show them a different path than the one their father had chosen. So we adopted them. Emma and Marcus, wide-eyed and confused, and so heartbreakingly young. We told them, in age-appropriate ways, that their parents had made very bad choices and would be gone for a long time. We didn't hide the truth, but we didn't burden them with details they weren't ready for. And slowly, painfully, our house began to fill with life again. Emma's laughter echoing in the kitchen where Richard used to steal cookies. Marcus's careful concentration as Henry taught him carpentry, the way Richard had learned. The sound of small feet running through rooms that had been silent for too long. Will never fully heal. The scars, both physical and emotional, run too deep. I still have nightmares about falling, about Damien's empty eyes, about Richard's face as he must have looked falling from Devil's Gorge. Henry still wakes up gasping from dreams of choices he can't change. Guilt he'll carry to his grave. But we survived. Against all odds, against our son's plans, against the 90-foot fall that should have ended us, we survived. And now we're living, truly living, in a way we haven't since the night Richard died. Evil can wear the face of your own child. It can grow in the home you built with love, can twist something precious into something monstrous. But truth, like love, always finds its way back. It might take 25 years. It might cost you everything. It might break you into pieces that never quite fit back together the same way. But it finds its way back. Did you like my story? Which city are you listening from? I'd love to know that my truth reached you, wherever you are in this world.